There is a tempting idea, persistent across many centuries and many philosophical traditions, that moral improvement is primarily a matter of gaining the right kind of insight. If you can just see clearly enough what is right, the living out follows naturally. William James thought this was, in its practical implications, almost entirely wrong, and he said so plainly, with the patience of someone who had watched the gap between moral insight and moral action open up in educated people again and again. James's psychology of virtue grows directly from his psychology of habit, developed at length in the Principles of Psychology in 1890. Habit, James argued, is the great flywheel of society, the mechanism by which the human nervous system preserves the gains of experience and frees attention for new challenges. Every action, when repeated, carves a groove in the neural substrate, making the next repetition slightly easier, slightly more automatic. The reverse is equally true. Every time you feel a good impulse and fail to act on it, you deepen the groove of an action, the groove of the self that feels virtuous things but does not translate them into behavior. Character, in this framework, is not something you have as a fixed attribute. It is something you are continuously making, through the specific choices of specific ordinary days. In Talks to Teachers, published in 1899, James drew the moral implications with characteristic directness. The worst mistake a person can make, he argued, is to feel a genuine good impulse and then do nothing with it. Every time you are moved to generosity and hold back, every time courage is called for and you wait, every time honesty requires something of you and you choose the easier path, you do not simply miss an opportunity. You actively weaken the connection between moral feeling and moral action. Over time, the moral sentiment and the moral deed separate until you become exactly the kind of person who feels fine things about themselves and does very little to justify the feeling. James called this keeping the faculty of effort alive by exercise, the idea that moral capacity, like any other form of capacity, grows with use and atrophies with neglect. The person who makes it a consistent practice to do at least one genuinely difficult thing each day, who does not allow themselves to drift indefinitely into avoidance, is not just accomplishing particular tasks. They are maintaining the infrastructure of a self that will be capable of acting well when it genuinely matters, when the cost is real and the temptation to do otherwise is strong. In The Moral Philosopher and the Moral Life, published in 1891, James approached the same territory from a more philosophical angle. He argued that moral demands are genuine and binding, arising from the real needs and claims of conscious beings in relation to each other. Moral philosophy could clarify what we owe to each other and provide reasoning for why those obligations hold. But the actual living of a moral life required something distinct: the ability to sustain effort in the face of resistance, to honor commitments when honoring them is costly, to keep promises when keeping them requires something of you. This was not a matter of having the right theoretical framework. It was a matter of having trained the will into reliable action. James had a particular concern about the moral life of educated people, those who were often genuinely skilled at articulating fine ethical distinctions and genuinely bad at the ordinary daily discipline of living those distinctions out. He saw a kind of moral aestheticism in such people. They preferred to contemplate virtue and hold sophisticated opinions about it, because contemplation was pleasurable and the exercise of virtue in actual life was difficult and unglamorous. He was not particularly gentle about this. Feeling moved by a noble idea was close to worthless if it produced no change in behavior. What mattered morally was what you actually did, especially on the ordinary unremarkable days when no one was watching and nothing dramatic was at stake. This bears on what we might call the infrastructure of moral life, the small, consistent, unglamorous habits that make larger moral actions possible when they are required. The person who is reliably honest in small transactions has been practicing honesty. When a situation arises in which honesty is genuinely costly, when it threatens something they value, when it will not be rewarded, they have something real to draw on. The person who has been meaning to start practicing does not have that resource available, however sophisticated their ethical views may be. James's account also implies that virtue is specific and grounded in context rather than general and abstract. You do not become courageous as a personality trait disconnected from action. You become courageous by choosing to do specific courageous things, in the actual domains and relationships where your life takes place. You become honest by being honest in the specific situations where dishonesty would be easier and more convenient. Character, for James, is ultimately the record of a life as it has actually been lived. It is visible not in what a person intends, or believes about themselves, or professes when asked, but in the pattern of what they actually do, day after day, in the situations that cost them something. That is an austere standard. It is also, James would insist, the only honest one available to us. Subscribe to The Psychology of William James to explore more of his timeless ideas.